Most gardeners think they're improving their soil when they lay down cardboard, but in a lot of real gardens it actually slows things down. I've tested cardboard sheet mulching in raised beds, market garden plots, and even around perennial beds, and the same issue keeps showing up. The soil underneath turns sluggish, water doesn't penetrate evenly, and the microbial life that's supposed to build your soil ends up stalled under a dense layer that breaks down far slower than people expect. What looks like a smart weed barrier often becomes a bottleneck for soil biology. The biggest mistake gardeners make with mulch is trying to block the soil instead of feeding it. The idea behind cardboard mulching sounds good on paper. You block sunlight, weeds die, organic matter eventually breaks down, and the soil improves. The problem is that cardboard is primarily compressed wood fiber. That means it's extremely carbon heavy and very slow to break down unless the conditions are perfect. Circular mulch works differently because the focus is not blocking the soil. The focus is feeding the soil in layers that cycle nutrients continuously. The circular mulch method works because it keeps nutrients moving through the soil instead of trapping them above it. Circular mulch is built on a simple idea. Every layer you add should feed the layer below it and eventually become soil itself. Nothing sits there as a dead barrier. In practice, the system starts with a light carbon layer, usually shredded leaves, chopped straw, or small wood chips, spread about 2 to 3 inches thick over the soil surface. This layer protects the soil from sun and moisture loss, but still allows air and water to pass through easily. On top of that carbon layer comes a thin but biologically active layer. This is where compost or worm castings come in. I typically spread about 1/2 inch of finished compost or a handful of worm castings per square foot across the mulch surface. That small addition introduces millions of microbes that start working immediately. Those microbes begin breaking down the carbon mulch above while feeding the soil life below. Instead of a blocked layer like cardboard, you get a living bridge connecting the surface mulch to the soil ecosystem. Worm activity is what makes the circular mulch system accelerate soil building. One thing I've noticed over the years is that whenever worm populations increase, soil improvement accelerates dramatically. Worms move organic matter downward, aerate the soil, and leave behind castings that are far richer in microbial life than most compost piles. That's why I like integrating vermicompost into this system. Even small amounts make a difference. If you add 2 or 3 cups of worm castings to a 4x8 raised bed every couple of weeks, the soil biology becomes noticeably more active. This is also where a dedicated worm composting system becomes incredibly useful. Instead of waiting months for a traditional compost pile, worm bins produce steady amounts of castings and liquid fertilizer. If you're curious about the type of setup that works well for small gardens, there's a worm compost bin similar to the one I use linked in the description. It's a stacked tray system that lets you process kitchen scraps into worm castings and liquid fertilizer without needing a big outdoor compost pile. It's not something you have to buy to use this method, but it makes maintaining the circular mulch system much easier. Let's talk about how this actually looks in a small backyard garden. In a typical 4x8 raised bed growing vegetables, I start by clearing the bed and loosening the top inch of soil. I don't dig deep because the goal is to protect the soil structure that already exists. Then I apply about 2 inches of shredded leaves or straw mulch. This usually takes about half a standard wheelbarrow load for a bed that size. Over that mulch layer, I sprinkle compost or worm castings lightly across the surface. The amount is surprisingly small. Roughly 4 to 6 cups spread across the entire bed is enough to seed the mulch with microbes. After watering the bed thoroughly, the system begins working on its own. Microbes begin decomposing the mulch, worms start pulling organic matter downward, and the soil gradually builds structure. Within about 6 to 8 weeks, that original mulch layer shrinks significantly as it decomposes. When that happens, I simply add another thin mulch layer and repeat the cycle. That's where the circular part of circular mulch comes from. Organic material moves continuously from the surface into the soil. The results become obvious after a single growing season. The first thing you notice is moisture stability. Beds using circular mulch usually require less frequent watering because the mulch layer slows evaporation while still allowing water to penetrate. The second improvement is root depth. Plants grown in beds without cardboard barriers tend to send roots deeper because nothing blocks the soil surface. And the third change is soil texture. After one season of repeated mulch cycling, the soil becomes darker, looser, and noticeably richer in organic matter. I've seen this happen in backyard beds, greenhouse containers, and even systems that transition into hydroponic nutrient recycling. When organic inputs cycle through worms and microbes, the nutrients become more stable and easier for plants to access. Circular mulch also works surprisingly well in container gardens. Many gardeners think mulch only matters in large beds, but containers benefit just as much. In fact, containers often dry out faster than ground beds, which makes mulch even more valuable. In a 5-gallon vegetable container, I typically add about 1 inch of fine mulch on the surface. Then I mix a handful of worm castings into the top ½ inch of soil every few weeks. This simple addition dramatically improves moisture retention and microbial life inside the container. Plants grown this way tend to show stronger growth and more consistent nutrient uptake because the soil ecosystem stays active rather than drying out between waterings. There are trade-offs, but the benefits outweigh them. The biggest trade-off with circular mulch is that it requires ongoing additions. Cardboard feels convenient because you lay it down once and forget about it. Circular mulch is more like feeding animals. You add small amounts regularly to keep the system alive. But those additions take minutes, and the payoff is a living soil that keeps improving every season. Another trade-off is that mulch materials must be reasonably clean. Straw contaminated with herbicides or treated wood chips can harm soil life. That's why I prefer shredded leaves, garden trimmings, and compost from known sources. The real secret is understanding that soil building is a cycle, not a one-time fix. So many gardening methods promise quick solutions. Lay down cardboard, add one miracle amendment. Fix the soil instantly. Healthy soil doesn't work that way. It improves through cycles of organic material moving through microbes, worms, and plant roots over time. Circular mulch simply accelerates that natural cycle by keeping fresh organic material entering the system regularly. And once you see how fast soil improves under that approach, cardboard stops looking like the clever trick it's often marketed as. If you want healthier soil and better harvests, focus on feeding the ecosystem. The difference between average gardens and thriving ones usually comes down to soil biology. When microbes and worms are active, nutrients cycle continuously and plants respond quickly. Circular mulch supports that process because every layer feeds the next layer. Nothing blocks the system, everything becomes soil. If you want to try the same approach, start small with one bed and watch how the soil changes over a season. And if you're interested in the worm composting setup I mentioned earlier, there's a link to it in the description so you can check it out. If this video helped you rethink how mulch works in the garden, subscribe to the channel and share this video with another gardener who's serious about growing better food. Practical knowledge spreads the same way healthy soil does, one layer at a time.